And welcome to another edition of Krown Gridiron Nation, everyone. There is Gord in Vancouver, Mike is in Tirana, and I'm here on beautiful, sunny Football Island with another edition of the 2-Minute Offense. Penn State, Michigan, and for the Nittany Lions, it was Jonathan Sutherland just bailing things out on the defensive side. He did have 7 tackles, but it was a blowout in favor of Big Blue. The native of Guelph, Tavius Robinson, getting a little bit better every game. 4 tackles, 1 sack, and 1.5 TFLs in a big win over Auburn. Damian Alford from Montreal with 1 catch for 34 yards for Syracuse. But the most important thing for the Orange, they remain undefeated and on a roll. Illinois, Minnesota, don't know what number to focus on here. Is it Chase Brown carrying the ball 41 times? Is it 180 yards? Is it 53 yards receiving and a touchdown? That's 233 yards in all-purpose. Sidney Brown also had one heck of a day as well. 5 tackles, pass defended, quarterback hurry, and an INT. UConn comes up just short against Ball State. Usually we're talking about Kevin Clarcius. He had 22 yards receiving, but it was Malcolm Bell who stood out for the Canadians. 9 tackles, 3 pass breakups, and a block kick. My goodness, Mr. Bell. Curtis Rourke is normal, reliable self and MAC action. 264 yards passing, did serve up an INT, but his feet did a lot of the work. 6 carries for 24 yards and a tutty. My goodness, this was a big week for defensive performances. And just look at Jeffrey Kent and Arku at Memphis. 11 tackles, a half sack, 1.5 TFLs, and a pass knockdown. Miami back to their winning ways, and the undisputed leader on defense this day was Akeem Messidor. 8 tackles, 3.5 sacks, my goodness. And the same number of TFLs to match, of course. Best college player versus best pro prospect. Who demonstrates this best out of our NCAA Canadians, and what is the difference between the two, Gord?
I would say that there are a couple big factors that separate college prospects from pro prospects, and one of them, depending on the position, is the versatility and skill set that they offer. And I'll take Chase Brown as an example of that. His stock is starting to rise quite a bit, but I think back to a couple years ago when Chuba Hubbard lights the world on fire in his last couple years at Oklahoma State. You know, we think he's a star in the making, big time standout at the college level. And the reaction to him was a little bit more lukewarm at the NFL level. And in fact, he actually did get a chance due to injury to kind of carry the load with Carolina. And he really struggled to do that. And one of the reasons he struggled to do that is that he was kind of a home run hitter in college, right? A big track athlete. You know, if he were able to get into space, he was just gone. But the challenge is in the NFL, a lot of the time that space doesn't exist to the same extent. You have to create a lot of your own space. And he never excelled at being able to create his own space. He also never excelled in the passing game, which brings me back to Chase Brown. And it was great to see Chase Brown add a receiving touchdown to his out-of-control yardage total this past weekend. Because primarily up until now, he's been just a straight tote the rock type of runner. But I wonder if Chase Brown is going to be a guy that, unlike what we've seen from Chuba Hubbard in the pros so far, ends up having a successful pro career, maybe even more so than his college career, because he has a little bit more of a well-rounded game, and he also has that ability to be a bell cow back. He had 41 carries this past weekend. I'm sure pro scouts are looking at that and raising their eyebrows, maybe a little bit worried about the workload, but also impressed that he can handle that kind of volume.
I think one thing that you have to look at is size. And, you know, if we're going to go back into that era from a couple of years ago, maybe Amen Ogbongbemiga is a good example of that, where you're kind of looked upon in the NFL as a tweener. Is he big enough to play linebacker? Is he fast enough to play DB? Is he better as a safety if at that size and speed? Like there's a lot of things that you have to look at. And, you know, sometimes guys will play bigger than they are, and some guys won't play as big as they are. So when you're looking at intangibles, that's one thing, but scouts are going to look at measurements, they're going to look at height, at weight, at arm length, at hand size, depending on the position. And sometimes you'll see a guy get kind of caught in that tweener mode, and that makes it interesting in the CFL draft because they have to project whether or not those tweeners are going to stick stateside.
And athleticism dominates the conversation too. Again, going back to that previous generation, seeing how some of these guys in their first couple of years in the pros have transitioned to the pros, athleticism can be a two-edged sword, right? A guy like Chase Claypool, for example, underwhelming production numbers in college, but then he blows the doors off the combine in testing season, and it vaults him into the third round. And ultimately, you can see that faith was rewarded in that he's had a quite productive first couple of years of his career. Josh Palmer, another guy, very good athleticism numbers, despite the fact that his production stats in college were maybe a little bit underwhelming. And sure enough, that has transitioned pretty well to the pros as well. So that is a factor that a lot of these scouts are looking for that can really make that difference too, in that there is athleticism that you can get away with at the college level that you may or may not be able to at the pro level.
And if you look at this going forward, I think you're seeing a generation of athletes now who maybe were not prototypical NFL players or even CFL players because of their position, especially if you're a DB. They're the occasional guy that would get to the NFL or get to the CFL, but now when you look at the guys who are playing in the NFL, Dean Leonard and Benjamin St. Juste and Javon Holland, and up here, teams using really high draft picks on players like Terrell Ford and Alonzo Adai, Patrice Rene. This moving forward, I think you're getting more and more positional players from non-traditional positions getting serious looks at the NFL, getting starting jobs in the NFL, and high draft pick spots in the CFL.
Stars, prospects, we've got them all in our Stateside 5. Over to UConn, and defensive back Malcolm Bell had a day. 9 tackles and a block kick against Ball State. He was a one-man machine. It is Curtis Rourke, a quality day, not an explosive day, 22 at 34, 264 and an INT, but he did get a TD rushing off 6 carries and 24 yards in a solid win over Western Michigan. Sidney Brown was all over the place for Illinois on defense. He had 5 tackles, a pass defended, a quarterback hurry, and of course, a big INT. Miami gets back to its winning ways, and the leading guy, the number 1 guy on defense was Akeem Messidor. 8 tackles, 3.5 sacks, and of course, matching TFLs to boot. And what can you say about Chase Brown on this show that hasn't been said already? 233 all-purpose yards and a TD, 180 of them were on 41 carries on the ground, added another 53 as a receiver, and that's where he got that trip to the promised land. And here they are, your Stateside 5 standings. Coming up, it is USports back at full throttle. Welcome back, everyone. 2 key rivalry games going on north of the 49th. We'll get you caught up on them in our 3-minute warning. Let's start with red and blue. Let's start with the rock fight, and really only one team was throwing rocks, and they were turning into touchdowns. Arnaud Desjardins goes 25 of 34 for 334 and 2 touchdowns. 2 favorite targets, Matthew Udon with 6 receptions for 115, and Edouard Arsenault, 3 receptions for 101 and a tutty, and Laval take it home over Montreal in front of 18,173 at Peps. And congratulations going out to Glenn Constantine. He passes Brian Tauris on the all-time head coaching wins list in Canadian University football history. Way to go, Glenn. An upset of sorts between Sherbrooke and McGill. Much heralded rookie Iola Latendresse, 18 of 29 for 254 and 2 TDs. He added 75 yards on 11 carries and another 2 TDs on top of that. I guess this is why he was a blue chipper. Sherby had a 14-0 lead in this thing until McGill blew the doors open. Another close one in the battle for the Wheat Belt, Regina and Saskatchewan. Mason Nias goes 20 of 30 for 297. Riker Frank was the star on the day for the Huskies. 18 carries, 86 yards and a TD, and 8 receptions for 132. Regina had a shot in this one, though. They recover the onside kick, but Noah Peltier serves up 1 of his 3 TDs on the day, and that was all she wrote. Calgary and Alberta is a curtain puller at Commonwealth Stadium for the Edmonton Elks. And the Dinos score a surprise win on the road in Edmonton. Mikel Desjardins, 8 touches, 118 yards, and a TD for the T-Rexes. Jason Brown with a good performance on the fake grass, 9.5 tackles. Manitoba, UBC, and a couple of big performances for the blue and gold in this one. Running back Isaiah Knight, 19 carries, 122. Jason Soriano, the lead target of Garrett Rooker, 7 catches, 117 and a TD. Ottawa rested their starters, including quarterback Ben Miracle, but JP Simikinda picked up the rest of the work, 22 carries for 231 and a pair of touchdowns. York coughs up another fur ball, a big 0 on the scoreboard. Windsor and Western, don't let this score fool you. It was close through 3. Windsor was only a touchdown behind at the end of 3, but then Western turns it on with 25 fourth quarter points. Edwards with 20 carries for 144 and a touchdown keeps the Purple Ponies perfect. Quentin Scott with another solid outing for Laurier at running back with a 142-yard day, leading them over Guelph. Have to mention Brandon Farrago, 13.5 tackles. He was all over the field for the Griffs. Malcolm Bussey, you remember him from last week and the week before and the week before last, posting big numbers at running back for X, 11 carries for 191 and 2 TDs. At least for Acadia, they got the ball to a lot of hands. 11 players had a reception. Liam Stewart with 5 catches for 101 yards and a touchdown as SMU wins their homecoming game in front of a sellout crowd over Mount A. About the inevitability of certain teams making it through to the conference final and likely winning that conference final. And I'd suggest that Ontario is probably the best example for that.
Yeah, Western is the alpha dog, no question about that. And, you know, if there's a regret here going into this season, and this is, you know, not a knock on Western, have just been fantastic, but it would be nice to see if Western was just not quite as good as they are, because the rest of the conference has been really interesting. There have been some really cool stories this year. Queens, you know, is Ottawa as good as Queens now? Have they surpassed them since their meeting earlier in the season? Where does Carleton fit in all of this? Mac getting hot at the right time, although they might not make the playoffs. Laurier being Laurier, always being around and always having a puncher's chance to win any game they play in. So that's you know, kind of the regret, at least in Ontario this year, is that Western has been so strong this year, but boy, they're really good, and it's always, you know, it always leaves you wondering what if they weren't that dominant.
And what's particularly scary about Western is it feels like they're just kind of doing whatever they want and still running away with games most weeks. You know, Edward Winati leads the way one week, and then it's Keon Edwards. This past weekend, Evan Hillock. And, you know, we were having the conversation where I said, well, you know, Windsor gave him a pretty good run, and then I went and looked at the final score, and the final score was 50-18 or something like that, and I went, holy smokes, what happened? And sure enough, Western piled on 25 points in the fourth quarter and made it into a laugher. And it feels like they have that level of skill right now where they can just kind of play with their food and then still walk away at the end of the day with a comfortable margin of victory. I would say, though, I know we don't pay a lot of attention to this conference, but the AUS is looking like it might be just as much of a fait accompli, as St. FX is starting to roll over people in that conference. They're undefeated thus far. And they won very comfortably against Acadia this past weekend in Wolfville. They look like they're far and away the class of that conference as well. So while they may be a relative minnow compared to the Western Mustangs, that conference is definitely a very clear alpha dog and everybody else as well.
But Gord, the weather hasn't changed yet. We know that teams out west usually are built 2 ways. One for that summer, fall type stuff, and the other for the winter. And we haven't got winter yet. How is that going to change things when it finally hits in the Canada West?
Well, those changes never seem to favor UBC to start with. You're talking about teams that are built for 2 seasons. Well, unfortunately, UBC in their home doesn't generally get that second season. And so they often struggle to travel to the prairies late in the season, which they have an outside shot at catching Regina for second place. That would be a huge development for them, so they could at least host that first round playoff game and make it a little bit more level playing field. But if it finishes Saskatchewan Regina 1-2 in the conference like I anticipate it will, UBC, despite the fact that they had a really good weekend this past weekend, is going to be really up against it going into those wintry conditions in the prairies where they historically have really not fared well. And then the rest of the prairie teams, I don't know. I think it's a wash. A lot of them deal with the same things. A lot of them are built with the same kinds of kids that grew up in the same kinds of places. So I don't know about that, but that is one team that unfortunately, when the weather changes, now fights an uphill battle unless they've secured home field advantage for themselves.
Just ahead, we go hoggy hunting. And here they are, your playoff scores in the CJFL. Welcome back, everyone. We talked about prospects earlier in the show, but now let's focus in on one group, and that's the offensive linemen. And Gord, in particular, eagerly looks forward to this segment on an annual basis, don't you?
Yeah, I know. The deal written into my contract is I only get one, so let's make the most of it, and we'll hit 5 offensive line prospects. I might even mention a 6th one in this segment. And we'll start with the guy that I talked about on our show last week and said we need to be talking way more about this guy, and it's Matthew Bergeron at Syracuse. A multiple-year starter for the Orange, who are now well within the top 25. They had another big victory against NC State this past weekend. They get a huge test upcoming this weekend on a wide stage, and that could be the stage where Matthew Bergeron really solidifies his stock in the NFL. He is a legitimate NFL guy. Fortuitously enough, I happen to see on social media a couple NFL draft guys talking about Bergeron as a possible top 50 prospect in this upcoming draft. So this is a guy that we really need to be watching. He has a prototypical NFL body. He's about 6'6", playing at about 330, 335. They love that kind of size and length in the NFL, but his movement skills are what really stand out. He's an excellent cutoff guy on the backside of run plays in particular, can hold his own in pass protection, and has been a big part of this ascending Orange team this season.
I'll go to Gabe Wallace now with the University of Buffalo. He's got that kind of size as well, and there's some NFL chatter. Not big chatter at this stage, but he's a guy that's been getting some talk. He's at UBuff, and 6'5", 6'6", 330. He's a big body. The neat thing about him is he's got a rugby background as well, so he brings that sort of flexibility and that rugby attitude to the line, which is never a bad thing. He's a guy that started outside. They moved him inside last year after a couple of games. He started every game last year. He's been at left guard all this year as well. So he's a guy that they kind of have pegged now as an interior guy, and he's going to get a look in the NFL. I don't know if he'd be a draft guy, but there's an opportunity for him to, even right now, I mean, with his stock before the combines, there's a chance that he could be a guy that would sign on the Monday.
And I would say that he's fortunate in terms of looking ahead for CFL prospects, that he's now got this wealth of experience inside, because we all know most CFL teams like to have their nationals playing in the interior of the offensive line. Another guy that is a true interior guy on the offensive line, and a guy that I think is more of a true CFL guy, is Kyle Hergel at Texas State. Hergel has had a lengthy, decorated career, had an excellent 3-year stint at University of North Dakota before transferring down to Texas State and moving up a level into the FBS. He was an all Sun Belt second team guy last year, at least according to PFF, and has had another excellent year this year, starting every game at the guard spot. He's only about 6'2" and about 305. So now we are talking more CFL size. That's not necessarily too small to play in the CFL. It's probably too small to play in the interior in the NFL. So if you're a CFL draft person, Hergel's a guy that I think will translate well, in that he does move quite well at that size and has a wealth of experience in a wide open offensive conference.
City Sow next up on the list, I guess, from Eastern Michigan, and I'll steal one of Mullen's patented moves and say he's been stateside for 5 years as a starter at Eastern Michigan, as he took advantage of the opportunity to defer. It's interesting, like a 5-year starter at Eastern Michigan. He's been all MAC a couple of years, the last 2 years, including first team last year. He's a guy that's ranked number 7 right now by CFL Central Scouting, a guy that should get a look in the National Football League again, whether it's a draft or an undrafted free agent situation. But there's a guy that was getting some looks last year by the CFL until he decided to defer. So big body, lots of skill, kind of the thing that scouts drool over.
Yeah, and Sal, with a start next weekend, will set the school record for most games started with, I believe the number is 60. That's incredible. And if he stays healthy the rest of the season, he will pass another Canadian, Jake Julian, for the most appearances in Eastern Michigan history with, I think it's 63. So he's had a fantastic decorated career. A guy that you probably heard a little bit about last year and then maybe wondered where he ended up in terms of the pros is Dante Bull. Dante Bull was at the top of the CFL Central Scouting Bureau list last year a couple of times, and then he decided to reclass and stay in school. And he has had a solid, though unspectacular, year at Fresno State this year. He's just kind of continued to do his thing. Unfortunately for him, his Bulldogs team has kind of fallen right off the map, going from a borderline top 25 team with Kalen DeBoer leading the charge to a team that I think only has 2 wins to this point in the season. So they have really struggled this year, and as a result, the buzz hasn't necessarily picked up down south for Dante Bull as much as he would have hoped, but he is another guy that does have NFL measurables, so you wonder if he will sneak in because he's had a long and successful career down there as well. But if not, I think he's a guy that will translate well and be an impact guy in the CFL if that's where he ends up. I just don't see him getting there right away because of those measurables. I think he'll hang around the NFL for a bit.
Games of the week coming up next. Time now for our games of the week. What do you got, boys?
Well, let's start with undefeated versus undefeated, shall we? Top 20 versus top 5, and it's Syracuse taking on Clemson. And, you know, Gordy talked about Bergeron a little bit earlier on, and this is a really good test for him, and to do it on a very large national stage. But another guy to watch is Damian Alford, and a guy to watch because we're hoping to see more of him. He's got everything needed to be a legitimate deep threat, certainly at the NCAA level. We just haven't seen it. Only 5 catches so far this year. So for the Montrealer, it's an opportunity, we hope, for him to break out. And boy, would there ever be a better time for a breakout game than a game on this kind of national stage.
Yeah, I would say this is actually the biggest game of the season for Matthew Bergeron, as there's likely multiple first-round picks on the Clemson defensive line. He's going to have his hands full. Not a lot of super compelling matchups this upcoming week, at least from a CanCon perspective. We don't have any teams where there's Canadian versus Canadian, unfortunately. But I will take another look at Penn State. Penn State coming off a big loss against Michigan, where Michigan really ran them out of the building in the second half. You know, Penn State kind of hung tight for about a half, and then Michigan pulled away from them, racking up over 400 yards rushing. It was a rough day for the Penn State defense and Jonathan Sutherland, but they're going to need to bounce back, and I think they're actually in a really good spot to do it. They go back home, and they take on a Minnesota team that was well regarded coming into the season, but has struggled a little bit and now has just lost quarterback Tanner Morgan to injury this past week. So I think this is a nice little get-right spot for the Nittany Lions as they look to reload for Ohio State in a couple weeks, because that's going to define their season as to whether this is another Penn State team that just can't quite get over the top, or a Penn State team that is actually ready to compete with the big boys at the top of the Big Ten.
For everyone on Krown Gridiron Nation, this is Jim Mullen saying, let's get out to that game.